Mother's Day came and went without a call, not even a text. Just silence from the children I'd sacrificed everything to raise after their father died. I told myself they were busy. That's what mothers do, we make excuses for the people who hurt us most, until I heard my son James say those words, "Mom doesn't matter anymore." Standing outside his window, I felt something inside me break, then rebuild into something harder, colder. They thought I was weak, oblivious. A footnote in their success story. What they failed to realize was that quiet doesn't mean powerless, and a mother's patience when it finally runs out can be terrifying. They wanted to erase me from their lives. Fine, but first I would show them exactly who their mother really was. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The clock on my kitchen wall ticked steadily toward 2 o'clock as I adjusted the white lilies in the center of my dining room table. A roast chicken, James's favorite, rested on the counter, its skin golden and crisp. Emma's preferred scalloped potatoes bubbled in the oven, the cheese topping just beginning to brown. I'd spent all morning cooking, cleaning, and preparing for my children to arrive. It was Mother's Day after all. I smoothed down my blue dress, the one Emma had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. I'd even gone to the salon yesterday to have my blonde hair trimmed and styled. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. 2:15 came and went. I sent text messages to both of them. Almost ready for you. Can't wait to see you both. No response. 2:30. I called James, then Emma. Both went to voicemail. Hi sweetie, it's Mom. Just wondering if you're running late. Dinner's ready whenever you get here. Love you. By 3 o'clock, a knot had formed in my stomach. I'd made phone calls, sent texts, even messaged Emma's Bradley on Facebook. Nothing. The food grew cold on the table as I paced around. My living room, that familiar maternal worry creeping up my spine. Had there been an accident? Were they okay? At 4, I called my son once more. James, honey, it's Mom again. I'm starting to worry. Please call me back when you get this. Just want to make sure everything's all right. By 6, my worry had transformed into something else entirely. Something cold and hollow that settled in the pit of my stomach. I covered the untouched food with plastic wrap and placed it in the refrigerator. Movements mechanical and precise. The special bottle of wine, a splurge at $45, remained unopened. I sank into my sofa, phone clutched in my hand, and stared at the blank television screen. The house had never felt so empty, not even in those early days after Michael died. When I'd suddenly found myself a widow at 36 with 2 young children to raise on my own. As the evening shadows lengthened across my living room floor, I opened Instagram on my phone, something I rarely did, and there they were. My children, living their lives without a thought for their mother. James's post showed him at a baseball game with friends, beer in hand, wide smile on his face. Posted 3 hours ago. Perfect day for the Mariners game. #Sunday Funday. Emma's profile featured a brunch photo with Bradley. Mimosas raised in a toast, her engagement ring prominently displayed. Best Sunday with my love. #blessed. I stared at those images until they blurred, hot tears spilling down my cheeks. They hadn't forgotten Mother's Day because of emergencies or accidents. They'd forgotten me because they had better things too. Sleep evaded me that night. I tossed and turned, replaying memories through my mind. Emma's high school graduation, where I'd worked double shifts for months to afford her dream prom dress. James's college tuition that I'd scraped together by selling my car and taking the bus to my hospital administrative job for 2 years. The vacations I never took. The dates I never went on. The life I put on hold so they could have everything. Morning found me exhausted but resolute. I wouldn't burden them with my hurt feelings. I would check on them, make sure they were truly okay. That's what mothers do. I drove across town to James's neighborhood, a collection of newly built luxury homes that made my modest ranch house look like a shack in comparison. His black SUV sat in the driveway of the imposing 2-story colonial with the manicured lawn. Relief washed over me. He was home. He was safe. I was about to ring the doorbell when voices drifted through an open window. My son's voice and his wife Sophia's carried clearly in the morning air. "Did your mom call again?" Sophia asked. "She left me a message too. Yeah, probably about Mother's Day." James's voice sounded dismissive, unbothered. "I'll call her back eventually. Don't you think you should?" She seemed worried. "Mom's fine. She doesn't matter anymore. We have our own lives now." His words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I stumbled backward down the porch steps, nearly falling in my haste to get away before they saw me. I made it to my car somehow, hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key into the ignition. "She doesn't matter Anymore, the words echoed in my head as I drove home. Vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Not forgotten, then dismissed. Discarded. A chapter closed. At home. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching photo frames that held smiling faces that now seemed like strangers. In the home office, I opened the drawer where I kept Michael's papers, seeking comfort in the documents that connected me to a time when I was valued, when I was essential to someone's world. That's when I found it. A folder labeled Wilson Family Holdings that I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were incorporation documents for Michael's construction supply company, the business he'd started from nothing. The business that had put food on our table for years before his heart gave out at 40-1, the business that James and Emma now ran. I frowned, scanning the legal language more carefully. According to these papers, as Michael's widow, I owned 51% of the company shares, the controlling interest, yet I received only a modest monthly stipend that barely covered my mortgage and utilities. A stipend my children had told me was all the company could afford while staying competitive. I reached for my laptop with trembling fingers. A quick search of Wilson Building Supply brought up a sleek website I'd never seen before. One of the Northeast's fast construction material providers, it proclaimed, annual revenue exceeding $15 million. My mind raced back to Christmas dinner last year, James complaining about cash flow issues, Emma mentioning the struggle to keep the business afloat, their pitying looks when I'd mentioned wanting to renovate my 20-year-old kitchen. I spent the next hours digging deeper, finding business news articles, press releases, and photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new locations. James in expensive suits, Emma accepting industry awards, their smiling faces as they built their lives on a lie dot. As night fell once more, I sat in my darkened living room, a different woman than I had been 24 hours before. The hurt remained, but something else had taken root alongside it. A cold clarity. A resolve. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I'd saved years ago but never used. Diana Reed's office, a crisp voice answered. "This is Mary Ann Wilson," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'd like to make an appointment with Ms. Reed as soon as possible. May I ask what this is regarding?" I paused, watching headlights sweep across my living room wall as a car passed outside. "Shareholder fraud," I said quietly, committed by my children. Sleep came easily that night, deep and dreamless. In the morning, I awoke with purpose, the path forward suddenly clear. I wouldn't confront them with tears and accusations. I wouldn't beg for explanations or apologies. I would take back what was mine, piece by piece, until they understood what they'd thrown away, and they would never see me coming. The law offices of Reed and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown. I felt out of place in my department store blouse and slacks, surrounded by sleek furnishings and people who looked like they stepped out of a business magazine, but Diana Reed didn't seem to notice or care about my modest appearance when her assistant showed me into her office. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, extending a hand. She was perhaps my age, with dark hair cut in a severe bob and eyes that missed nothing. "Please, have a seat." I'd brought the folder of documents with me, along with printouts of everything I'd found online. As I laid them on her desk, I explained my situation, trying to keep my voice clinical and detached. I nearly succeeded until I got to James's words. "He said I don't matter anymore," I said, my voice finally breaking. "After everything I gave up for them." Diana's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, a brief flash of genuine anger. "Let me be clear, Mrs. Wilson," she said, tapping a manicured nail on the incorporation documents. "If these are authentic, what your children have done isn't just unkind, it's illegal. They've deliberately concealed your majority ownership while diverting profits away from you." "They're authentic," I confirmed. My husband was meticulous about his paperwork. He wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. Diana nodded, already making notes. "We'll need to establish a clear paper trail. Do you have access to any company financial records? Bank statements, tax returns?" I shook my head. "They've kept me completely removed from the business side. They give me a monthly stipend and tell me it's all the company can afford." I believed them. "Of course you did," Diana said, a hint of softness entering her voice. "They're your children. You trusted them." She straightened in her chair. "But trust without verification is a luxury you can no longer afford, Mrs. Wilson. From this moment forward, we need to operate with absolute discretion while we build our case." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you can't let them know you're suspicious. You need to maintain the status quo while we work behind the scenes." "Can you do that?" I thought of the Mother's Day table I'd set, the hours spent cooking food that was never eaten, the calls that went unanswered. "Yes," I said firmly. "I can do that." Over the next 2 weeks, Diana and her team worked tirelessly, uncovering layer After layer of deception, they found bank accounts I never knew existed, property holdings in the company's name, tax records showing profits that never made their way to me. With each new revelation, my resolve strengthened. "We found something interesting," Diana said during our third meeting, sliding a document across her desk. "Your husband established a trust fund for you that would activate when the business reached certain revenue milestones. According to these projections, that should have happened 5 years ago." "I never knew about this," I said, scanning the document. "Because your children diverted the funds, we've traced at least $2.3 million that should have gone into your trust." The amount took my breath away. I'd been living month to month, carefully budgeting my modest stipend, while my children had stolen millions from me. "We're preparing to file for an injunction," Diana continued. "Once we do, they'll know you've discovered their fraud. But before we take that step, I'd like to get as complete a picture as possible. Is there anyone else who might have information about the company? Anyone your husband trusted?" I thought for a moment. "George Sullivan. He was Michael's best friend and business partner in the early days, but I haven't spoken to him in years. The kids had some kind of falling out with him after they took over?" "I wonder why," Diana said dryly. "Let's find him." George still lived in the same suburban neighborhood where he and Michael had spent countless weekends grilling and watching football. His hair had gone completely gray, and grief had carved new lines into his face since I'd last seen him. But his eyes lit up with recognition when he opened his door. "Marianne Wilson," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. My God, it's been ages. Over coffee in his modest kitchen, I explained why I had come. George's expression darkened as I spoke, anger replacing surprise. "I knew something wasn't right," he said, shaking his head. "When the kids pushed me out 3 years ago, they claimed the company was struggling and couldn't support my consulting contract anymore, but I had clients telling me Wilson was underbidding everyone in the market. You don't do that when you're struggling. Did you ever try to contact me about it?" George looked down at his coffee cup. "I called you once. James answered your phone. Said you were resting and he'd give you the message. I'm guessing you never got it." "No," I said quietly. "I never did." George retrieved a box from his garage files he'd kept from his time with the company, including emails from James and Emma that directly contradicted what they'd been telling me. Diana's team would later call these documents the smoking gun. "Michael would be heartbroken," George said as I was leaving. "He built that business for all of you, not just for them." "I know," I said. "That's why I have to fix this." With Diana leading the charge and George providing crucial insider knowledge, we began assembling a legal strategy that would not only restore my rightful ownership, but potentially result in criminal charges against my own children. The thought made me physically ill, but each new discovery hardened my determination. Diana managed to freeze one of the smaller company accounts, which yielded enough money to provide me with a modest advance. "Just a fraction of what they owe you," she assured me. I used some of it to begin renovating my kitchen, partly out of necessity. The ancient dishwasher had finally died, and partly as a small act of rebellion. For years, I'd put off the renovation because my children had convinced me the company couldn't afford to help me. What if they notice? I asked Diana, suddenly worried as the contractors began demolition. "Let them," she said with a shrug. "If they ask, tell them you took out a home equity loan, but I doubt they'll notice. People who don't value you rarely pay attention to your circumstances." The harsh truth of her words stung, but I recognized their accuracy. Meanwhile, I maintained the illusion of normalcy. I called my children occasionally, keeping conversations light and brief. I didn't mention Mother's Day again. When Emma mentioned a charity gala she was hosting, I expressed appropriate enthusiasm and declined her perfunctory invitation, citing a non-existent book club meeting. In reality, I did attend the gala not as a guest, but as an observer. Diana suggested it might provide useful intelligence. So I volunteered to help the catering staff, donning a black uniform and keeping my hair tucked under a cap. Neither of my children spared a glance for the older woman refilling water glasses and clearing plates. From my invisible vantage point, I watched Emma and Bradley work the room, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly. I overheard snippets of conversation plans for a vacation home in the Berkshires, Bradley's new boat, the expansion of the company's distribution center. "The company's had its best quarter ever," Emma told an elegant older woman. "We're thinking of diversifying into green building materials next." I nearly dropped my tray of empty glasses. Just last week, she'd called to ask if I could cut back on my allowance for a few months because the company was facing some challenges in the current economy. Later, I watched from across the ballroom as Emma and Bradley huddled with James and Sophia, their heads close together in serious conversation. The body language was tense, particularly between James and his wife. Sophia kept shaking her head slightly, her expression troubled as James spoke emphatically, one hand chopping the air for emphasis. Diana needs to see this, I murmured. To myself, wishing I could get closer without being recognized, as if the universe had heard me. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Call me when you can. New development. I slipped away to the staff break room and called her immediately. We've just received notification that someone's been making inquiries about the trust accounts, Diana said, without preamble. They know something's happening, but they don't know what or who's behind it yet. What does that mean for our timeline? It means they're getting nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Keep your eyes open but maintain your cover. This is good news for us. Sure enough, the next morning, James called the first time he'd initiated contact since before Mother's Day. Mom, hey, he said, his voice artificially bright. Just checking in, how are you feeling? I'm fine, James, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Why do you ask? No reason. Just, making sure you're taking your vitamins and stuff. Your age and all. My age, I was 53, not 83. I'm perfectly healthy, but thank you for your concern, I said, adding a slight wobble to my voice. Two could play at manipulation. It's so nice to hear from you. We should have dinner soon. I miss you and Emma. There was a slight pause. Yeah, definitely. Actually, I was thinking the same thing. Why don't you come over next Friday? Emma and Bradley will come too. Sophia's been wanting to host for ages. I doubted very much that Sophia, who seemed perpetually uncomfortable around her mother-in-law, had been wanting to host for ages, but I agreed enthusiastically. That would be lovely. Should I bring anything? No, just yourself. Another pause. Actually, do you still have Dad's old files? Emma was saying she'd love to look through some of the early company stuff for a presentation she's doing, and there it was. They weren't checking on my health, they were checking on what I might know. I might have some things in the attic, I said vaguely. I'll have a look before dinner. Great. I'll tell Emma, she'll be thrilled. After hanging up, I immediately called Diana. They invited me to dinner, I said, and they're asking about Michael's files. Perfect, Diana said. That tells us exactly what they're worried about. Next Friday, you said? That works out well. We'll be ready to file the initial paperwork the following Monday. You'll go to dinner, be your normal self, give nothing away. By Monday afternoon, they'll be served with the first round of legal documents. And then what? I asked, a flutter of anxiety in my stomach. And then, Diana said, the real battle begins. In the week leading up to the dinner, Diana and her team continued building our case. They discovered offshore accounts where company profits had been diverted, identified board members who might be sympathetic to my situation, and prepared the extensive legal filings that would shatter the comfortable world my children had built on their lies. Meanwhile, I prepared in my own way. I visited the cemetery where Michael was buried, something I hadn't done in months. I stood by his headstone, the spring breeze rustling through nearby trees. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, I told him quietly. They're still our children, but they've become people I don't recognize. Michael, people who could look me in the eye and lie while taking everything you built for us. There was no answer, of course. Just the distant sound of traffic and birds calling to each other across the cemetery grounds. But as I placed fresh flowers by his grave, I felt a sense of calm certainty. Michael had always valued honesty above all else. He would have been devastated by our children's betrayal. The night before the dinner, Diana met me at my house, bringing final documents for me to sign and reviewing our strategy once more. Remember, you're just a mother looking forward to seeing her children, she said. No matter what they say or do, give nothing away. By this time next week, they'll understand exactly what they've done it, who they've done it to. After she left, I stood in my kitchen looking at the partially completed renovation. The new cabinets were in, but the countertops were still covered with protective paper, the backsplash only halfway finished. A work in progress, much like my plan. My phone chimed with a text from Emma. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Bring those files if you find them. I smiled slightly as I typed my response. Me too, sweetie. Can't wait to see you all. In the quiet of my home, I mentally rehearsed the role I would play tomorrow. The oblivious mother, the trusting victim. For just a little longer, outside, a spring storm was brewing, lightning occasionally illuminating my living room in brief, brilliant flashes. It felt fitting the calm before my own storm broke. I placed my empty teacup in the sink and headed for bed, ready for what tomorrow would bring. My children thought they'd written me out of their story. They were about to discover that I was just beginning a new chapter, and this time I would be the one holding the pen. The morning of the family dinner arrived with unusual clarity. As if the universe itself was acknowledging the significance of what lay ahead. I moved through my kitchen with deliberate care, preparing a tray of my famous lemon bars, Emma's childhood favorite, to bring despite James's insistence that I needn't contribute anything. Diana had called earlier, her voice steady and reassuring. Remember, Marianne, this is your last interaction with them before everything changes. Observe but reveal nothing. If they present any documents, do not sign them under any circumstances. I understand, I'd told her, feeling strangely calm. I've been practicing my clueless mother routine for years, apparently. Tonight should be no different. As I carefully arranged the lemon bars in a container, my phone rang again. It was George. Just checking in, he said, concern evident in his voice. Diana told me about tonight. Are you sure you want to go through with this? It's not too late to try talking to them first. I paused, looking out my kitchen window at the flowering dogwood Michael had planted the year before he died. 20 years later, it stood tall and strong, its white blossoms catching the afternoon sunlight. If I thought talking would make a difference, I would, I said quietly. But they've been lying to my face for years, George. They had every chance. To be honest, to treat me with basic decency, they chose differently. I understand, he said after a moment. Call me tomorrow. Let me know how it went. I will, I promised, grateful for his concern. I chose my outfit with Kara navy blue dress that was flattering but not flashy, comfortable low heels, minimal jewelry. Nothing that suggested I was anything other than what they believed me to be, their easily dismissed mother, living a small life while they built empires on stolen foundations. I arrived at James and Sophia's house precisely at 6. The container of lemon bars in one hand and a small gift bag in the other. James answered the door himself, his smile too wide, his hug too enthusiastic. Mom, great to see you, he said, ushering me inside. You didn't have to bring anything. I couldn't come empty-handed, I replied, keeping my voice light and pleasant. The lemon bars are for dessert, and this is just a little something for Sophia to thank her for hosting. The gift, an expensive scented candle I'd found on clearance, was calculated. Over the years, I'd noticed how James and Emma reacted when I gave even modest gifts, exchanging glances that said, should we tell her to save her money? Tonight would be no different, but now I understood the source of their concern. The house was immaculate as always, all gleaming surfaces and designer furniture. Sophia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine white apron. Marianne, welcome, she said, accepting my awkward hug. Was it my imagination, or did she hold on a moment longer than usual? Thank you for the gift. You didn't need to do that. It's nothing really, I said, noting how her eyes didn't quite meet mine. Emma and Bradley arrived 10 minutes later, both dressed as if they'd come from a business meeting rather than their home. Emma air-kissed my cheek, her eyes already darting around the room. Mom, you look well, she said, her tone suggesting mild surprise. Thank you, sweetheart. You look lovely too. I reached for her left hand. The ring is still stunning. Have you set a date yet? A shadow crossed her face briefly. We're thinking next spring. There's just so much happening with the business right now. Speaking of, James interrupted, handing me a glass of white wine. I thought we could chat a bit about the company after dinner. Emma's putting together this great presentation on our history, and we'd love your input. How nice, I said, taking a small sip of wine, though I'm not sure how much help I'll be. Your father handled all the business matters. But you were there from the beginning, Emma said, her voice honeyed with false interest. Your perspective is so valuable. Dinner proceeded with a strange undercurrent of tension beneath the polite conversation. Sophia seemed particularly quiet, responding to questions but offering little else. Once, when James reached across the table to refill my wineglass the third time he'd tried to do so, she shot him a look I couldn't quite interpret. So, Mom, Emma said as we moved on to dessert. My lemon bars arranged artfully on Sophia's best china. Tell us what's new with you. You seem ... different somehow. I smiled, cutting a small piece of the dessert. Nothing much has changed, dear. Although I did finally start that kitchen renovation I've been talking about for years. James paused mid-bite. Kitchen renovation. That must be expensive. It's nothing extravagant, I said with a dismissive wave. Just updating the essentials. The dishwasher finally died, and well, if I was replacing that, it seemed silly not to tackle the cabinets too. How are you paying for it? Emma asked, bluntly, then flinched when Bradley nudged her under the table. I've been saving, I said simply, and the nice thing about getting older is that your credit score improves. The bank was very accommodating. The lie came easily, and I watched with hidden satisfaction as my children exchanged quick glances. Money I didn't have, paying for renovations. I'd previously been told I couldn't afford. It was the first hint that something had changed. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where Emma mysteriously produced a slim leather portfolio. "Mom, while we have you here," she began, her voice taking on the professional tone I'd heard her use with clients. "We wanted to discuss some routine company matters." "Oh," I said, looking appropriately puzzled. "Nothing complicated," James assured me quickly. "Just some updated paperwork that needs your signature. Standard stuff that should have been handled years ago." Emma opened the portfolio and extracted several legal documents, placing them on the coffee table between us. "These just clarify the company's current operational structure. As you know, Dad's original setup was pretty old-fashioned." I picked up the first document, pretending to scan it with mild interest. Thanks to Diana, I knew exactly what it was: a transfer of remaining shareholder rights that would effectively remove my last connections to the company while releasing James and Emma from any fiduciary responsibilities toward me. "This seems very legal," I said, furrowing my brow. "I'm not sure I understand all of this terminology." "It's really just formality," James said, producing a pen from his pocket. "The company's attorney drew it up to protect everyone involved. Nothing changes for you. You'll still receive your monthly checks." I noticed Sophia shifting uncomfortably on the sofa beside him, her eyes fixed on her lap. "Maybe I should have my own attorney look it over first," I suggested mildly. Emma's smile tightened fractionally. "Do you have an attorney, Mom?" "No, but I could find one. Don't these things usually require a notary or something?" "Not necessary in this case," James said quickly. "But if you're uncomfortable, we can certainly postpone." His forced smile didn't reach his eyes. "No rush at all." "Speaking of the company," Bradley interjected, clearly trying to change the subject. "We just finalized that acquisition in Vermont. The new facility is incredible." James shot him a warning look, but Bradley continued, oblivious. "The profit margins on that place are going to be astronomical once we implement the new pricing structure. Between that and the Pennsylvania expansion, next quarter should break all records." "Expansion?" I echoed, feigning ignorance. "My goodness, that sounds substantial. I had no idea the company was doing so well." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Emma glared at Bradley, who finally seemed to realize his mistake. "It's all very recent," James said smoothly, "and required significant investment. Actually, that's part of why these documents are important. They help us secure the financing for these growth opportunities." The bold lie hung in the air between us. I nodded as if accepting his explanation, but inside, my resolve hardened further. The uncomfortable moment was interrupted by a sudden ringtone. My phone was vibrating in my purse. I glanced at the screen and saw George's name. "Excuse me, I should take this," I said, moving toward the entryway for privacy. "George, is everything all right?" I asked, aware that my children could probably still hear me. "Marianne, I just got word from a friend at the bank. James has authorized the sale of the original factory property. The papers were filed this afternoon for a closing next week." My heart clenched. The original factory, the small building where Michael had started everything, working nights and weekends to build his dream. He'd always refused to sell it, even as the company outgrew the space and moved operations elsewhere. It was the cornerstone of his legacy. "I see," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll talk to you tomorrow." I returned to the living room where my children were huddled in intense conversation that abruptly ceased when I appeared. "Everything okay?" Emma asked with feigned concern. "Just a friend with a question," I said, reclaiming my seat. I looked directly at James. "Actually, I was wondering how the original factory building is doing these days. I was feeling nostalgic about it recently. Your father was so proud of that place." James's face betrayed nothing, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly around his glass. "It's fine. Still part of our operations." Another lie delivered without hesitation. "We should visit sometime," I suggested. "I haven't been there in years." "It's not very impressive anymore," Emma said quickly. "Just old office space. And storage now." I nodded, letting the subject drop. The evidence continued to mount, not that I needed more at this point. As the evening wound down, I gathered my empty container and purse, ready to leave. "Before I go, I almost forgot to mention I found some of your father's old papers in the attic yesterday. Would you like me to bring them by the office next week?" Both of their expressions sharpened with interest. "That would be great," James said, a bit too enthusiastically. "What kind of papers are they?" I shrugged. "Oh, all sorts of things. Old photographs, some letters, business documents from the early days. I haven't gone through them thoroughly yet. Why don't I come by tomorrow and help you sort through them?" Emma suggested immediately. "It would save you the trouble of bringing them to the office." "That's very thoughtful," I said, smiling warmly. "Tomorrow would be perfect." As James walked me to my car, he draped an arm around my shoulders in a gesture that once would have felt comforting but now felt calculating. "It was really good to see you, Mom," he said. "We should do this more often." "I'd like that," I replied, allowing him to help me into the driver's seat, although I needed no assistance. "And don't worry about those papers," he added casually. "If you decide you'd rather not sign right now, we completely understand." "Thank you, James. I just like to be careful with legal matters. Your father always taught me that." Something flickered behind his eyes, annoyance, worry, but his smile remained fixed as he closed my car door and waved goodbye. I drove away slowly, watching in my rearview mirror as he remained in the driveway, phone already pressed to his ear. When I turned the corner, I pulled over, my hands suddenly shaking on the steering wheel. The evening had been even more revealing than I'd anticipated. The lies, the manipulation, the thinly veiled urgency to have me sign away my rights through my car's side mirror. I could see James and Emma standing in the driveway, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion, though I couldn't hear them. Their body language told me everything I needed to know. James gestured emphatically while Emma shook her head, her arms crossed defensively. Finally, she nodded reluctantly, and I heard James's words clearly through my partially open window. "Get those papers from Mom's house tomorrow, whatever it takes." I drove home in silence. No radio, no distractions, just the steady rhythm of my heartbeat reminding me that tomorrow would change everything. The pieces were moving into place. The storm was about to break. The morning after the dinner, I awoke. Early, purposeful energy coursing through me despite having slept poorly. I knew Emma would arrive unannounced, attempting to catch me off guard. Diana had prepared me for this likelihood, and I had spent the previous afternoon creating what she called a false flag, a collection of innocuous documents and photographs that contained nothing of actual value to our case. I was arranging these papers on my dining room table when the doorbell rang at 9:30. Emma stood on my doorstep, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, a paper tray with 2 coffee cups in her hands. "Morning, Mom," she said brightly. "I brought your favorite hazelnut latte with an extra shot." "Emma, what a lovely surprise," I exclaimed, accepting the coffee and stepping aside to let her in. "I wasn't expecting you so early. I had some free time this morning and thought I'd come help with those papers you mentioned." Her eyes darted past me, scanning the interior of the house. "Have you started going through them?" "Just barely," I said, gesturing to the dining room table. "I pulled out what I could find, but honestly, there's so much, I'm not even sure what's important anymore." Emma's face relaxed slightly as she approached the table, taking in the scattered photographs. Old greeting cards and various documents I'd arranged, nothing incriminating, nothing valuable, just the mundane detritus of a long marriage and family life. "This is great, Mom," she said, setting down her coffee and immediately beginning to sort through the papers. "You've done most of the work already. Well, I thought it might help if I organized things a bit first. Why don't you sit down and we can go through them together?" For the next hour, Emma and I sorted photographs and reminisced about the past. It was strange in another context. This might have been a genuine bonding moment between mother and daughter. But I couldn't forget why she was really here, what she was really looking for. "You were such a beautiful bride," I said, holding up a wedding photo of Emma and Bradley from their engagement party. "Have you made any more wedding plans since last night?" A shadow crossed her face. "Not really. We're still trying to figure out the right timing with everything else going on." "Everything else meaning the business?" I asked innocently. Emma hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. She set down the papers she'd been examining and took a sip of her coffee. "Mom, I want to be honest with you," she began, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they're about to tell a calculated version of the truth. "The business is going through some transitions right now. There are opportunities we need to act on quickly, which is why those papers you and Dad saved could be so important." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, watching her closely. "Expansion, possibilities, new markets. Dad always had such a clear vision for the company, and we're trying to honor that." She paused, her expression softening artificially. "Which reminds me, James and I were thinking it might be good to create a more formal role for you at the company." I raised my eyebrows in feigned surprise. "A role? For me? But I don't know anything about the construction supply business." "Nothing major," she assured me quickly. "Maybe something ceremonial, like founder's representative. You could attend the annual shareholders meeting, be part of special events. It would be a way to honor Dad's legacy." I knew exactly what this was, a transparent attempt to placate me, to make me feel included without giving me any actual authority or information. 6 months ago, I might have been pathetically grateful for the gesture. "That's a lovely thought," I said, smiling warmly. "It would be nice to be more connected to your father's company." Emma looked relieved. Exactly. That's why those documents from yesterday would be helpful. They're part of establishing that new arrangement. Well, I'll certainly think about it more carefully, I promised. It's just that your father always told me to read everything twice before signing. Dad was always so cautious, Emma said with a tight smile. But sometimes that caution held the company back. We've had to be more nimble since taking over. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, her expression changing instantly. I need to take this, she said, already standing and moving toward the living room for privacy. I couldn't hear all of her conversation, but her tone shifted from professional to alarmed in seconds. What? When? A pause. No, that's impossible. Who authorized that? Another pause. I'm at Mom's. No, nothing here. Just old photos and stuff. A longer pause? I'll be there in 20 minutes. She returned to the dining room, her face carefully composed but tension evident in her posture. I'm so sorry, Mom, but I need to run. There's a situation at the office that needs my attention. Is everything all right? I asked, genuine concern in my voice despite everything. Just a misunderstanding with a vendor, she said dismissively. Nothing serious. Can we continue this another time? Maybe I could come back tomorrow. Of course, sweetheart. The papers aren't going anywhere. I watched from my front door as Emma practically ran to her car, her phone already pressed to her ear again as she pulled away from the curb. The moment she turned the corner, I called Diana. It's happening, Diana confirmed when she answered. The first injunction was just served at the company headquarters. We've also filed motions to freeze the primary accounts and halt the factory sale. Emma just got a call and left in a hurry, I said, my heart racing. She seemed very upset. That's just the beginning, Diana said, satisfaction evident in her voice. The board has called an emergency meeting for 3 o'clock. You need to be there, Marianne. It's time to show your hand. The reality of what was happening hit me suddenly. After weeks of preparation, years of deception, decades of sacrifice, it was all coming to a head in a matter of hours. What if they refuse to let me in? I asked. They can't, Diana said simply. You own the company, Marianne. Remember that when you walk into that room? I'll meet you at my office at 2 to go over the final details. After hanging up, I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by the innocuous family photos and papers that had so disappointed Emma. My phone began buzzing with text messages from James, increasingly urgent demands to know if I'd given those papers to anyone else, if I'd spoken to anyone about the company recently, if I was planning to come to the office today. I left them all unanswered instead. I went to my bedroom closet and pulled out the charcoal gray suit I'd purchased the week before my armor, as Diana had called it, professional, expensive-looking, confidently understated. Not the outfit of a woman who could be dismissed or manipulated. As I dressed, I thought about Michael. What would he think of what I was about to do? Would he understand that this wasn't about revenge, but about justice? About teaching our children that actions have consequences, that character matters more than profit? I believed he would. The man I'd loved had valued integrity above all else. He had built his company on honest work and fair dealing. Our children had corrupted that legacy, and now it was up to me to reclaim it. At precisely 2 p.m., I walked into Diana's office, straight-backed and resolute. She looked up from her desk and nodded approvingly at my appearance. Perfect, she said. Now let's go over what to expect. The board consists of 7 people. Including James and Emma, George has spoken with 3 of the other members, Howard Bennett, Patricia Walsh, and Thomas Farrell. They're bewildered by the legal filings, but open to hearing your side and the other 2, I asked. Robert Mason and William Taylor. They're James's golf buddies, appointed after your husband died. Expect them to be hostile, but it doesn't matter once the evidence is presented. They'll have to acknowledge your majority ownership or face serious liability themselves. Diana handed me a folder containing copies of all the key documents we'd be presenting. You don't need to memorize everything. I'll handle the legal explanations. Your job is to be exactly who you are, Michael Wilson's widow, the rightful owner of his company, a mother who has been deliberately deceived by her children. At 2:45, we arrived at Wilson Building Supply headquarters, a modern 3-story building in the business district that I'd visited only twice since Michael died. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition when I approached the desk. Mrs. Wilson, we weren't expecting you. I'm here for the board meeting, I said pleasantly. Would you please let them know I've arrived? I'm not sure. Let me call Mr. Wilson's assistant. Within minutes, a flustered young woman appeared in the lobby, clearly having received conflicting instructions. Mrs. Wilson, I'm Jessica, James's executive assistant. I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Today's meeting is a private board session. I'm well aware of what the meeting is, I said calmly. And as the majority shareholder of this company, I'll be attending. This is my attorney, Diana Reed. The young woman blanched. I'll let them know you're here. Diana and I were directed to wait in a small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. Through the glass partition, I could see the board members assembling. James and Emma entered last, both looking harried and tense. When James spotted me through the glass, he froze momentarily before rushing over and opening the door. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice pitched low. "And who is this?" "This is Diana Reed, my attorney," I said, rising to my feet. "And I'm here for the board meeting, James." "This is a closed session," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "Company matters. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything about Wilson Building Supply concerns me," I replied, my voice steady. "As Michael Wilson's widow and the majority shareholder of this company, I have every right to be present." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about? What has Emma been telling you?" "Emma has told me nothing truthful for years," I said. "Now, shall we join the others? I believe we're already keeping them waiting." Diana stepped forward, her professional demeanor unflappable. "Mr. Wilson, you can either invite us into that meeting, or we can add obstruction to the growing list of legal issues facing you and your sister. Your choice." James's jaw worked as he struggled to find a response. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing stiffly toward the boardroom. The conversation inside stopped abruptly as we entered. Emma, who had been speaking animatedly to an older man I recognized as Howard Bennett, turned toward us with an expression of disbelief. "Mom, what's going on?" I smiled at the assembled board members, most of whom I recognized from company functions over the years. "Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the unexpected nature of my visit, but given today's developments, I felt it was time we spoke." "Directly, Mrs. Wilson," Howard said, rising from his seat. "This is certainly a surprise. James was just explaining that there's been some sort of legal misunderstanding." "It's no misunderstanding, Howard," I said, taking the empty seat at the head of the table. "Michael's old seat. For the past 7 years, my children have systematically deceived me about my rightful ownership of this company while diverting profits that should have come to me as the majority shareholder." The room erupted in confused comments and questions. James attempted to regain control of the situation. "Mom, you're confused," he said loudly. "You've been misled by someone with their own agenda. Dad left the company to Emma and me. You've always known that." Diana placed a stack of documents on the table. "Actually, Mr. Wilson, your father did no such thing. These are the original incorporation documents, ownership certificates, and Michael Wilson's will and estate plans. They clearly show that Mrs. Wilson inherited 51% of the company upon his death, with you and your sister receiving 24.5% each." "That's impossible," Emma protested. "We would have known." "You did know," I said quietly, looking directly at my daughter. "You both knew. The question is, when did you decide to hide it from me? When did you decide I didn't matter anymore?" Emma flinched. At hearing her brother's words thrown back at them, the board members were examining the documents Diana had distributed, murmuring among themselves. "These appear to be authentic," Patricia Walsh said, looking up from the papers with a frown. "James, MIS, there's some explanation for this discrepancy?" "It's more than a discrepancy," Diana interjected smoothly. "We have documented at least 23 instances of deliberate financial misrepresentation to Mrs. Wilson, systematic diversion of funds from her trust accounts, and falsified company records designed to conceal the company's true profitability. We're prepared to present all of this evidence to the relevant authorities if necessary." The implied threat of criminal charges hung in the air. James and Emma exchanged panicked glances. "This is ridiculous," James blustered. "Mom's always received her stipend exactly as Dad arranged it." "My stipend, as you call it," I said, "represents less than 1% of what I should have received as the majority owner of this company." According to the financial records Diana has obtained, Wilson Building Supply has generated over $40 million in profit during the 7 years. You've been in control, yet I've received less than $300,000 in total during that time. The board members looked stunned at these figures. Robert Mason, one of James's golf buddies, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "If these allegations are true," he said carefully, "the board has been misled as well. We've approved compensation packages and dividend distributions based on financial statements that may have been ... incomplete." "They were fraudulent," Diana corrected firmly. "And yes, that does create potential liability issues for board members who failed in their fiduciary duties. However, Mrs. Wilson is primarily concerned with rectifying the situation moving forward, not pursuing claims against anyone who was themselves deceived. It was a masterful move separating the board members from James and Emma, offering them a path to protect themselves by siding with me. "What exactly do you want?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my daughter, this stranger who shared my blood but apparently none of my values, and felt a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, and, despite everything, love. "I want what's rightfully mine," I said simply. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want the company your father built to be run with integrity again." I paused, holding her gaze. "And I want to understand how we got here, how the children I raised came to believe that stealing from their mother was acceptable." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. James stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Emma's face had crumpled slightly, a glimpse of the daughter I'd once known showing through her professional facade. Howard Bennett cleared his throat. "I think, given the seriousness of these allegations and the documentation presented, the board needs to take immediate action. I move that we temporarily suspend James and Emma Wilson from their operational roles, pending a full investigation." Seconded. Patricia Walsh said promptly. "You can't do this," James protested, rising to his feet. "This is our company." "No, James," I said quietly but firmly. "It's my company, and you've just been fired." James's face contorted with fury as the board members voted one by one to suspend him and Emma from their positions. The decision was nearly unanimous, with only William Taylor, James's most loyal golf buddy, abstaining rather than voting against the motion. "This is insane," James sputtered, looking around the table for support that wasn't coming. "You're making a terrible mistake. All of you." "The meeting is adjourned," Howard Bennett announced, ignoring James's outburst. "We'll reconvene tomorrow to appoint interim leadership and establish parameters for the investigation." As the board members gathered their papers and began to file out, offering me awkward nods of acknowledgement, Diana leaned close to my ear. "This went better than expected," she murmured. "But brace yourself. They won't go down without a fight." She was right. Even as the room emptied, I could see James and Emma huddled with William Taylor in the corner, gesturing angrily. Their glances in my direction promised retaliation. George Sullivan was waiting in the reception area when Diana and I emerged from the boardroom. His face broke into a relieved smile when he saw us. "How did it go?" he asked anxiously. "They've been suspended pending investigation," I told him. The board seemed genuinely shocked by the evidence. "They should be," George said grimly. "I've spent the morning going through financial records with Diana's team. The level of deception is staggering." Diana checked her watch. "We should go. I want to file the additional injunctions before the courts close today." As we walked toward the elevator, the sound of breaking glass and a thunderous crash echoed from down the hallway, followed by raised voices and alarmed shouts. "What was that?" I asked, startled. A young man in a company polo shirt came running around the corner, his eyes wide. "Mrs. Wilson, you might want to. I think Mr. Wilson is having some kind of breakdown." The three of us followed him back down the hall to a large corner office, with James Wilson, CEO, etched on a brass plate beside the door. Inside, chaos reigned. James was standing amid the wreckage of what had once been an elegant executive suite. The computer monitor lay shattered on the floor. Bookshelves had been overturned, and framed awards hung crookedly from the walls or lay broken on the carpet. James himself stood behind his desk, his tie loosened, hair disheveled, breathing heavily. As he held a crystal award like a weapon, Emma stood in the doorway, her face ashen. "James, stop," she pleaded. "This isn't helping." He didn't seem to hear her. His gaze locked onto me, and the raw hatred in his eyes made me step back involuntarily. "You," he snarled. "You did this. You did this to yourself," I replied quietly, aware of the growing crowd of employees gathering in the hallway behind us. "All I did was uncover the truth." "The truth," he laughed bitterly. "The truth is, you were perfectly content to cash your checks and stay out of our way until someone convinced you that you deserved more." "Who was it, George? Did he fill your head with lies about what Dad really wanted?" "Your father wanted honesty and integrity in his company," George said, stepping forward. "Not what you've turned it into." James hurled the crystal award against the wall, causing several onlookers to gasp as it shattered. "Get out," he shouted. "All of you, get out of my office." "It's not your office anymore, James," Diana said calmly. "And if you continue destroying company property, we'll have to involve the police." For a moment, I thought he might launch himself across the desk at us, but Emma stepped forward and placed a restraining hand on his arm. "James, please," she whispered. "You're making things worse." The fight seemed to drain out of him suddenly. He slumped back into his chair, running his hands through his hair. I turned away, unable to bear the sight of my son's unraveling, regardless of what he'd done. In the hallway, employees quickly pretended to be going about their business, avoiding eye contact. Diana ushered me toward the elevator, George following close behind. "That display will work in our favor," Diana said once we were safely inside the elevator. Multiple witnesses saw his inability to control himself. It reinforces everything we've claimed about his unfitness to lead. I nodded, though I took no pleasure in the thought. He was still my son, even now. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and painful revelations. True to Diana's prediction, James and Emma launched a counteroffensive, but it was as desperate as it was despicable. "They're telling people you have dementia," George informed me over coffee at my kitchen table. "James has been calling board members, major clients, even family friends, claiming that you're being manipulated because of cognitive decline." I shook my head in disbelief. "That's their defense, that I'm mentally incompetent." "It's all they've got," Diana said, looking up from her laptop. "The financial evidence is irrefutable. They need to discredit you personally to have any chance of maintaining control." 2 days later, I discovered just how far they were willing to go. I was working in my garden when a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached, carrying a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Dr. Edward Palmer. I believe your son James arranged for me to see you today." I straightened up, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "Did he? That's news to me." The doctor looked uncomfortable. "He expressed significant concerns about your memory and decision-making, said you'd agreed to an evaluation." I might have been angered by this ambush if Diana hadn't warned me it was coming. Instead, I smiled pleasantly. "I see. Well, since you're here, would you like to come in for some tea? Though I should mention that my attorney advised me to record any medical evaluations requested by my children. I hope that's not a problem." Dr. Palmer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Recording is ... unusual in these circumstances." "These are unusual circumstances. Doctor, my children are attempting to portray me as incompetent to cover up their financial crimes. Surely you weren't aware of that context." The doctor's expression shifted from discomfort to alarm. "Financial crimes? No. James mentioned only that there was a family business dispute and concerns about your memory." "Then perhaps we should both get some clarity," I suggested, gesturing toward the house. "I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and I have some documentation that might interest you as well." 2 hours later, Dr. Palmer left my house with a very different understanding of the situation. He'd administered several cognitive assessments, all of which I passed with flying colors. Reviewed the evidence of James and Emma's deception. "Mrs. Wilson," he said as he prepared to leave, "I feel I should tell you that your son offered to pay me an unusually large fee for this evaluation. He seemed very interested in a specific outcome." "Are you saying he tried to bribe you for a dementia diagnosis?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The doctor chose his words carefully. "I'm saying that his request bordered on ethical impropriety, and I'll be documenting that in my report." That evening I received an unexpected call from Sophia, James's wife, Marianne. "It's Sophia. I need to talk to you, not over the phone. Can I come by tomorrow morning?" When James is at his lawyer's office, her voice sounded strained, fearful almost. "Of course," I said. "Is everything all right?" "No," she said simply. "Nothing is all right. I'll explain tomorrow." When Sophia arrived, the next day I hardly recognized her. The polished, confident woman who had hosted dinner 2 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled. "Thank you for seeing me," she said as I ushered her into the living room. "I've been wanting to call you for days, but James... He checks my phone." "Checks your phone," I repeated, alarmed. "Sophia, what's going on?" "Everything's falling apart," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Since the board meeting, James has been... different. Angry all the time, paranoid. He stays up all night going through papers, making calls, he's drinking too much. And now, with the frozen accounts, he's panicking about money." I sat beside her on the sofa. "I'm so sorry you're caught in the middle of this." She looked at me directly, wiping away tears. "Don't apologize. You did what you had to do. I've known for years that something wasn't right with how they were treating you. I just... I didn't want to see it. It was easier to believe James when he said you were happy with the arrangement." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked gently. Sophia reached into her purse and withdrew a flash drive. "Because I found these files on James's computer. They prove he and Emma knew exactly what they were doing from the beginning. They planned it all right after your husband died." She handed me the drive with trembling fingers. "James would destroy me if he knew I was giving you this." I took her hand. Sophia, if you're afraid of him, I'm leaving him, she interrupted. I've already spoken to a divorce attorney. I just needed to do this first. Make this one thing right. After Sophia left, I immediately called Diana and arranged to meet her at her office with the flash drive. The files confirmed our worst suspicions. Detailed plans to systematically mislead me about my ownership rights, strategies for limiting my financial information, even discussions about potentially having me declared incompetent if I ever discovered the truth. This is the smoking gun, Diana said grimly as we reviewed the documents. With this evidence, criminal charges are virtually guaranteed. The news of Sophia's defection hit James hard. His attempts to portray me as mentally declining lost all credibility when his own wife publicly contradicted him. But rather than retreat, he and Emma escalated their campaign through George's connections with longtime employees. We learned that James had been approaching staff members, asking them to sign statements, suggesting I had shown confused behavior during my rare visits to the company over the years. Most refused, but a few, fearing for their jobs, complied. Meanwhile, Emma made a tearful appearance at a community charity event, one she knew I regularly supported. I watched from the back of the room as my daughter stood at the podium, her voice breaking with calculated emotion. My brother and I are going through an incredibly difficult time right now, she told the gathered crowd. Our beloved mother, who has struggled with memory issues since our father's death, has been influenced by individuals with their own financial motivations. We're doing everything we can to protect her while preserving the company our father built. The performance was masterful, the concerned daughter, the devoted guardian of her father's legacy. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her myself, but her credibility crumbled when Bradley Herr approached me privately the following day. He came to my house unannounced, looking nervous and uncomfortable. Mrs. Wilson, I need to speak with you, he said when I opened the door. It's important. I let him in cautiously, remembering Diana's warning not to meet with any family members without witnesses present. I left my phone recording in my pocket, just in case. Bradley paced my living room, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. Finally, he turned to me. I want to make a deal, he said bluntly. I have information about James's offshore accounts Emma doesn't even know about. He's been moving company money there for years, even hiding some of it from her. Why? Would you tell me this? I asked skeptically. Because this whole situation is spiraling out of control, he said, running a hand through his hair. Emma's talking about postponing our wedding indefinitely. Her assets are frozen. She's facing potential criminal charges. This isn't what I signed up for. And what exactly did you sign up for, Bradley? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. He had the decency to look ashamed. I fell in love with Emma, the successful businesswoman with the bright future. Not ... This. He straightened his shoulders. Here's my offer. I give you information that helps your case against James specifically, and in return, you guarantee Emma keeps her position in the company. Separate her from James's worst actions. I studied him carefully. You're throwing James under the bus to save Emma and, by extension, your comfortable future. I'm being practical, he countered. James is finished no matter what. The evidence against him is too strong. Emma still has a chance if someone speaks up for her. I told him I would consider his offer and discuss it with my attorney. As soon as he left, I sent the recording to Diana, who confirmed what I already suspected Bradley's offer revealed. That James and Emma's united front was beginning to fracture. The final blow came when Diana's team discovered the offshore accounts Bradley had mentioned. The documentation proved that James had been siphoning funds not just from me, but from the company itself, and by extension from Emma's share as well. When presented with this evidence, Emma's attorney immediately began negotiating a separate settlement for her. She's willing to cooperate fully against James in exchange for leniency. Diana informed me. She claimed she wasn't aware of the full extent of his actions. Do you believe her? I asked. Diana shrugged. It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that she's willing to provide testimony that strengthens our case. The question is, are you willing to treat them differently? To punish James more severely than Emma? I thought about my children, the babies I had nursed, the teenagers I had guided, the adults who had betrayed me. Despite everything, I couldn't completely extinguish the love I felt for them, but I couldn't ignore what they had done either. I need time to think about it, I said finally. The next day, the board voted to appoint George Sullivan as interim CEO while the investigation continued. When I arrived at the company headquarters to meet with him, I found the atmosphere dramatically changed from my previous visit. Employees greeted me respectfully, some even warmly. Word had spread about what James and Emma had done, and many staff members, especially those who had worked for Michael, were firmly in my corner. George gave me a tour of the building, introducing me to department heads and longtime employees. In Michael's old office now, George's temporary workspace, he showed me the changes James had made to the company. Some innovative, many problematic. He wasn't a bad businessman, George admitted reluctantly. Just a bad son, as we talked about the company's future. My phone rang. It was Sophia, her voice tight with tension. James is in the hospital, she said without preamble. He collapsed at his attorney's office an hour ago. The doctors think it was stress-induced, possibly a panic attack, but they're running tests. To rule out a heart attack, my hand tightened around the phone. Whatever James had done, he was still my child. Which hospital? Memorial. 4th floor. A pause. He's asking for you, Marianne? I don't know why, but he is. I looked at George, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand. Go, he said simply. Family comes first. It always did. For Michael, the hospital corridor seemed endless as I made my way to James's room. Outside his door, I hesitated, unsure what I would find, what I would say. The emotional armor I'd worn for weeks suddenly felt heavy and constraining. I pushed open the door to find my son lying in a hospital bed, looking smaller and younger than I had seen him in years. Monitors beeped steadily beside him. When he saw me, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been shame. Mom, he said, his voice hoarse. You came. Of course I came, I replied, moving to the chair beside his bed. You're my son. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything between us almost tangible in the sterile hospital air. The doctors say it wasn't a heart attack, he finally said. Just stress and exhaustion, probably too much coffee and not enough sleep. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The practiced words of accusation I'd rehearsed so many times seemed hollow now. Faced with his vulnerability, why did you ask for me? I finally said. James looked away, staring at the window where afternoon sunlight streamed through partially closed blinds. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it, he said. I don't know how it got this far. How? What got this far? All of it, he sighed, gesturing weakly at the air between us. The lies, the company, the money. He turned back to me, his expression pained. It wasn't supposed to be like this. After Dad died, the company was struggling. We made some decisions, temporary measures. We told ourselves to protect the business by stealing from me. I couldn't keep the hurt from my voice. It didn't feel like stealing at first, he admitted. Just reallocating resources where they would do the most good. The company needed cash flow to survive, and you never seemed interested in the business side of things. Because you deliberately kept me in the dark, I reminded him. He nodded slowly. Yes, we did. And then months turned into years, and the temporary measures became permanent, and it was easier to keep going than to admit what we'd done. His voice cracked slightly, and somewhere along the way I started believing our own lies. That we deserved it all? That you were fine with what you had? I studied my son's face, seeing both the man he had become and the boy he had once been. When did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as an obstacle? James closed, his eyes a tear escaping down his cheek. I don't know. Maybe when the company really started taking off and we realized how much we'd have to pay you if we were honest. Maybe earlier. Maybe when Dad died and I was angry that you couldn't save him. The last words hit me like a physical blow. You blamed me for your father's death? Not rationally, he said quickly. But you were a hospital administrator? You knew all the doctors. I thought you should have been able to do something. It was easier to be angry at you than to accept that nobody could have saved him. James's confession in the hospital room opened a floodgate of long-suppressed emotions and resentments. For the first time in years, we were having an honest conversation, though it was. Your father's heart condition was congenital, I said quietly. No one could have prevented what happened. Not the doctors, not me, not you. I know that now, James replied, his voice weak. But back then, I needed someone to blame. And then the blame turned into resentment. And the resentment made it easier to justify what we were doing with the company. I reached out hesitantly and took his hand. It felt cold and unfamiliar. The hand of a stranger who happened to be my son? Why did you tell Sophia I didn't matter anymore? I asked, the question that had haunted me since that morning outside his window. James winced, unable to meet my eyes. I was trying to convince myself more than her. Every time I thought about what we were doing, I felt ... ashamed. It was easier to pretend you weren't important than to admit I was betraying my own mother. Before I could respond, the door opened and Emma stood frozen in the doorway, staring at our joined hands with an expression of disbelief. Emma, I acknowledged, not letting go of James's hand. She entered the room cautiously, as if approaching a potentially dangerous situation. The nurses said you were here, I didn't believe them. Why wouldn't I come? I asked. He's still my son. You're still my daughter. Emma's composure cracked slightly, even after everything. Family is complicated, I said simply. She sank into a chair on the other side of James's bed, her designer handbag clutched tightly on her lap like a shield. The board voted George in as interim CEO, she said to James. It's all over the office. People are taking sides. There shouldn't be sides, I interjected firmly. This isn't about choosing between us. It's about acknowledging the truth and finding a path forward. Emma stared at me, then at her brother. James was telling you, wasn't he? About how it started? I nodded, and Emma seemed to deflate slightly, as if relieved of a burden she'd carried too long. It was my idea, she confessed suddenly. The initial deception about the ownership percentages, James wanted to tell you everything after the first year, when the company stabilized, but I convinced him not to. James looked at his sister in surprise. Emma, don't know. She deserves the whole truth, Emma interrupted, her eyes locked with mine. I was the one who created the offshore structures. I was the one who suggested the trust fund diversion. I was better at the financial side than James. He was the face of the company, but I engineered the fraud. Her blunt admission stunned me. Into silence, James closed his eyes. Whether in pain or relief at the shared burden, I couldn't tell. Why? I finally managed. Emma's laugh was bitter and brief. Because I was tired of being overlooked. Dad always focused on him for the company, teaching him the business. I was the daughter who was supposed to get married and have babies, not help run a construction supply company. Your father never said he didn't have to say it. It was always implied. Help your brother Emma. Support James. Emma. Never. Lead the company someday, Emma. Her voice broke slightly. And then after he died, you did the same thing. Everything was James this, James that. Checking on his classes, his girlfriends, his future. Did you ever once ask me about my business courses? My career plans? The accusation hit me hard because I recognized the grain of truth in it. Had I unconsciously favored James? Had I continued Michael's pattern without realizing it? I'm sorry if I made you feel less valued, I said carefully. That was never my intention. Intention doesn't matter, Emma replied, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Reality matters. And the reality is, I built myself into someone who couldn't be ignored or overlooked. I made myself essential to the company's success. Through fraud, I pointed out gently. Through whatever means necessary, she countered, but I could see the first flickers of shame in her expression. And now it's all falling apart anyway. The three of us sat in a triangle of complicated emotions, air, hurt, love, betrayal, all swirling together in the sterile hospital room. A family fractured but still somehow connected. Where do we go from here? James finally asked, his voice stronger than before. That depends, I said, choosing my words carefully. Do you both understand what you've done? Not just to me, but to your father's legacy, to the people who work for the company. They exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. I understand, James said quietly. At least, I'm starting to. Emma nodded reluctantly. I knew it was wrong. I just convinced myself it was justified. Then perhaps there's a path forward, I said. Not an easy one, not without consequences, but one that doesn't end with my children in prison. The relief on their faces was palpable, though tempered with wariness, as if they suspected a trap. Before we could discuss details, a nurse entered to check James's vital signs, effectively ending our conversation. I stood, gathering my purse. I need to go, I said. Diana's expecting me. We'll talk more when you're released. James. As I turned to leave, Emma spoke up. Mom, thank you for coming, for listening. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. Behind the polished exterior and calculated expressions, I could still see echoes of the little girl who had once followed me around the house, desperate for attention and approval. We're family, I said simply. That hasn't changed, even if everything else has. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. James was released from the hospital after 2 days, diagnosed with exhaustion and high blood pressure, but otherwise physically healthy. Emma postponed her wedding indefinitely after a tense conversation with Bradley about his attempted deal with Mia. Conversation I may have orchestrated by anonymously. Sending her the recording of our meeting, Diana arranged for a family counselor, specializing in high-conflict situations, to meet with the three of us at her office. Dr. Melissa Warren was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't there to take sides. My job is to facilitate honest communication, she explained as we sat in Diana's conference room. Not to determine who's right or wrong. From what I understand, there's plenty of wrong to go around. For 3 grueling hours we talked through decades of family dynamics, Michael's death, The early days of James and Emma taking over the company, the gradual erosion of honesty and trust, old wounds were reopened, painful truths acknowledged. Dr. Warren pushed us to move beyond accusations to understanding, beyond anger to the hurt that fueled it. By the end, we were all emotionally exhausted, but had reached a tentative framework for moving forward both as a family and as business associates. This is just the beginning, Dr. Warren cautioned, as we prepared to leave. Rebuilding trust takes time and consistent effort from everyone involved. Outside Diana's office, James hesitated before getting into his car. "Mom, would you want to come see the company headquarters tomorrow? I mean, really see it, not just the boardroom, see what we've built, despite everything else." The invitation was awkward, but sincere, a small olive branch I chose to accept. The next day, I walked through Wilson Building Supply headquarters with new eyes, not as an outsider or an enemy, but as the majority owner seeing her company for the first time. James led me through each department, introducing me to employees both new and familiar. Some greeted me warmly, others with wary politeness. In what had been Michael's office, temporarily George's, and before that, James's side stood by the window overlooking the company grounds. The business had grown dramatically from the small operation Michael had started. Despite the fraud, despite the deception, my children had built something substantial. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished," I said, surprising myself as much as James. "Not how you did it, but what you built." James looked startled. "You really think so?" "He always believed in the company's potential," I replied. "He just wouldn't have sacrificed his integrity to achieve it." As we continued the tour, we passed a wall of framed photographs documenting the company's history. I stopped, noticing something odd. "Where are the pictures of your father?" "Of the early days." James looked uncomfortable. "We redecorated a few years ago. Went with a more modern aesthetic." "You erased him," I said, realization dawning. "Removed the reminders of who really built this place." "It wasn't like that," James protested, but his expression betrayed him. "It was exactly like that," I insisted. "You couldn't face the daily reminder of whose company you were stealing?" Rather than becoming defensive, James surprised me by nodding slowly. "You might be right. I never thought about it that way, but maybe subconsciously." This small admission, this willingness to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth felt like the first, genuine step toward reconciliation. Later that week, I gave an interview to a prominent business magazine that had been following the Wilson Building Supply saga with great interest. Diana had arranged it as a way to control the narrative that was rapidly spreading through business circles. "Mrs. Wilson," the journalist began, "this is quite a remarkable story. How does it feel to discover that your own children deliberately deceived you for years?" I chose my words carefully, aware that my response would be read not just by the business community, but by James and Emma as well. "It's been painful, of course, but I've come to understand that what happened wasn't simple greed or malice. It was the result of complex family dynamics that began long before they took control of the company. My late husband unintentionally created an environment where our son was groomed for leadership, while our daughter felt overlooked. After his death, I continued those patterns without realizing it." "Are you excusing their behavior?" the journalist asked, clearly surprised by my response. "Not at all. What they did was wrong legally and morally. They'll face appropriate consequences. But as their mother, I have to acknowledge that I played a role in creating the circumstances that made those choices possible. And what about the future of Wilson Building Supply? Will you be taking over leadership permanently?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm not a businesswoman. I never wanted to run the company. I simply wanted what was rightfully mine, and for the company to operate with the integrity my husband valued. We're working on a restructuring plan that will achieve those goals while preserving what's best about what my children have built. That's remarkably generous, given the circumstances." I smiled slightly. "It's not generosity, it's pragmatism. Destroying the company would hurt hundreds of employees who did nothing wrong. And despite everything, it's still a family business. Or just redefining what that means." The interview was published the following week, generating significant response from the business community. Most praised my measured approach. Though some criticized me for not pursuing maximum penalties against James and Emma, I didn't bother responding to the critics. They weren't the ones who had to live with the consequences of my decisions. Meanwhile, Diana and her team had been negotiating with the district attorney's office regarding potential criminal charges. The evidence against James and Emma was substantial, but I had made it clear that I preferred a resolution that focused on restitution rather than incarceration. "The DA is willing to consider a plea arrangement," Diana informed me during a meeting in her office. "Given your preference and the cooperation we're now receiving from both James and Emma, They're open to suspended sentences, probation, and mandatory financial ethics training instead of jail time. And the company, I asked, that's more complicated. Diana admitted. The board wants reassurance that nothing like this will happen again. They're suggesting a complete restructuring of the governance model, with you maintaining majority ownership but professional management handling daily operations. That sounds reasonable, I said. Neither James nor Emma can return to leadership roles immediately, if ever. They need to earn that privilege, not have it handed back to them. They won't like that, Diana warned. They're not in a position to dictate terms, I reminded her. But I'm not looking to punish them indefinitely. I want a structure that allows them to prove themselves over time if they choose to. As Diana made notes, I gazed out her office window at the city below. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, unaware of the family drama playing out 15 floors above them. Life continued its steady pace. Regardless of our personal upheavals, there's one more thing, Diana said, interrupting my thoughts. The offshore accounts we discovered, they contained significantly more money than we initially estimated. Once recovered, your share comes to just over $12 million. The figure momentarily took my breath away. $12 million, plus whatever compensation the board approves for the years of underpayment. You're going to be a very wealthy woman, Marianne? I sat with that knowledge for a moment, trying to process what it meant for my future. For years, I'd lived modestly, carefully budgeting my allowance from the company. The thought of such wealth was almost disorienting. I never wanted to be rich, I said finally. I just wanted what Michael intended for me, what I was owed. Well, now you'll have both, Diana said with a small smile. The question is, what will you do with it? It was a question that followed me home that evening, lingering in my mind as I moved through my partially renovated kitchen. The modest updates I'd planned now seemed almost laughably inadequate. I could rebuild the entire house if I wanted, too. But as I stood in my living room, surrounded by photographs and memories of the life I'd built, I realized that wasn't what I wanted at all. This house, humble as it was, had been my home for 30 years. It had sheltered me through grief and joy, through loneliness and purpose. It didn't need to be transformed into something grander to have value. Much like me, I thought with sudden clarity. I didn't need wealth or power or revenge to have worth. I had always been enough, exactly as I was. My children had forgotten that truth had perhaps never fully understood it, but I hadn't. As twilight settled over my neighborhood, I made a decision about the path forward for myself, for my children, and for the legacy Michael had left us. It wouldn't be easy. The wounds were still fresh, the trust still fragile. But for the first time since that forgotten Mother's Day, I felt a sense of hope that something new and possibly better could emerge from the wreckage of our family's painful unraveling. 3 months had passed since that fateful Mother's Day when my children had forgotten me, or rather, when I'd discovered just how thoroughly they'd written me out of their lives. The legal proceedings were moving forward. The company was operating under temporary leadership, and my relationship with James and Emma existed in a fragile state of cautious communication. The morning was unusually warm for early autumn when my phone rang. It was Sophia, her voice tense and hurried. "Marianne, it's James. He's back in the hospital. It's worse this time." My heart clenched. What happened? He collapsed during a meeting with his lawyers. They're saying it might be a minor stroke or a severe panic attack. The doctors are running tests, but he's asking for you again. I didn't hesitate. I'm on my way. The hospital was busier than during James's previous visit. I navigated through crowded hallways to the cardiac unit where a nurse directed me to his room. I found him connected to more machines this time, looking pale and diminished against the white sheets. A doctor was checking his vitals when I entered. "Mom," James said, his voice weaker than I remembered. The word, so simple, so fundamental, hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything, I was still his mother. He was still my son. The doctor nodded to me and stepped out, giving us privacy. I moved to James's bedside, taking his hand automatically. The lawyer was reviewing potential plea agreements, James explained, without prompting. Reading out the list of financial crimes they could charge me with, suddenly I couldn't breathe. The room started spinning. "What are the doctors saying?" I asked. "Not a stroke, thankfully. Severe anxiety attack with symptoms that mimicked cardiac distress. They want to keep me for observation." He attempted a weak smile. "Apparently, fraud and embezzlement are stressful occupations." I didn't return the smile. "This isn't a joke, James. Your health is serious." His expression sobered. "I know, it's just easier to make jokes than face what I've done. What's coming next?" We sat in silence for a moment, the beeping monitors providing a steady backdrop. Then James spoke again, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear. "I want to tell you everything, Mom. No more lies, No more excuses. Just the whole truth. While I still have the chance. The chance, I repeated, alarmed. Figure of speech, he assured me. But these health scares, they make you think about what matters. About what you leave unsaid. Over the next hour, as nurses came and went discreetly around us, James confessed the full extent of what he and Emma had done. The systematic deception had indeed begun shortly after Michael's death, when the company faced a genuine financial crisis they had hidden from me. We needed to make decisions quickly, James explained. The construction market was tanking, and our biggest client was threatening to switch suppliers. We held an emergency board meeting without telling you. Why? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because we thought you'd panic, that you wouldn't understand the business side of things. Dad had always protected you from that. I bristled at the phrasing. Your father didn't protect me. We had a division of responsibilities. He handled the business. I handled our family and my own career. James nodded slowly. I see that now, but back then we saw it differently. I thought I was doing what Dad would have wanted, making the tough decisions without burdening you. Decisions about my company, my inheritance? Yes, he admitted. And once we'd excluded you from that first decision, it became easier to exclude you from the next one and the next one, until eventually, Until eventually you convinced yourselves I had no right to be involved at all. He didn't deny it. The bigger the deception grew, the more impossible it seemed to come clean. We'd have had to admit years of lies, of theft, and by then, we'd built our lives around the money, the status. When did Emma become involved in the financial manipulation? I asked. Almost immediately, James said. She was actually the one who figured out how to restructure things to minimize your visibility into the company's finances. She has a gift for numbers, for systems. Dad never saw it because he was so focused on teaching me the business. I thought about what Emma had said in the hospital during James's first stay, her resentment at being overlooked. Her determination to make herself essential. Pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of family dysfunction I'd been blind to 4 years. Did you ever consider just talking to me? I asked. Being honest about the company's struggles? James looked away. By the time we pulled through the crisis, we'd already set everything in motion. The separate accounts, the restructured ownership records, it seemed easier to keep going than to undo it all. He paused. And then, when the company started really succeeding, we told ourselves we deserved the rewards, that we'd earned them by saving the business, while I was living on a stipend that barely covered my expenses, I said, unable to keep the hurt. From my voice, I know, he said quietly. There's no justification for that part. None at all. As James continued his confession, Emma arrived, clearly having rushed from somewhere else. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, her brother in the hospital bed. Me sitting beside him, their secrets being laid bare. What's happening? She asked, moving cautiously into the room. The truth, I said simply. All of it. Emma sank into a chair on the opposite side of James's bed. She looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. Are you okay? She asked her brother. Not really, he admitted. But getting there? Emma turned to me, her expression guarded. And you, are you recording this conversation for the lawyers? No, I said firmly. This isn't about legal proceedings. This is about understanding how my family fell apart. Something shifted in Emma's posture, a slight relaxation, a lowering of defenses. It started before Dad died. You know, she said quietly. The distance between us, you were always so busy with work and taking care of him when he got sick. James and I were already adults, so we told ourselves we didn't need you anymore. Her blunt assessment stung, but I couldn't deny the grain of truth in it. Michael's extended illness had consumed much of my attention during their early 20s. Had I missed crucial moments of connection, failed to see they still needed mothering, just in different ways? After he died, Emma continued, it was easier to push you further away than to deal with our grief together. And then the company. Issues started, and one decision led to another, and suddenly years had passed with this wall between us. A wall you built, I reminded her. Yes, she acknowledged, surprising me with her directness. We built it. But maybe you didn't try very hard to tear it down either? This stopped me short. Had I accepted their distance too readily? Allowed myself to be pushed to the margins of their lives without sufficient resistance? Perhaps you're right, I conceded. Perhaps I was so focused on not being a burden to you that I failed to insist on my place in your lives. The admission seemed to catch Emma off guard. She'd clearly expected defensiveness, not reflection. In that moment, something subtle shifted between USA crack and the wall she'd mentioned. Allowing a thin beam of understanding to shine through, James reached for both our hands, creating a physical connection among the three of us. For the first Time and years. We need to stop thinking about who's to blame and start figuring out how to fix this, he said. If that's even possible. It's possible, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. Difficult, painful, but possible. Emma's eyes filled with tears, real ones, not the calculated displays she'd perfected for business and social situations. How can you even want to try, after what we did? I considered her question carefully. Because beneath all the hurt and betrayal, you're still my children. And because I'm not willing to let what Michael built, both the company and our family, be destroyed completely. Before either could respond, a doctor entered to check on James and deliver test results. The interruption gave me a moment to collect my thoughts, to examine the swirl of emotions this conversation had stirred up. Anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was increasingly tempered by something else, a growing understanding of how we had all contributed to the broken state of our family. The doctor confirmed that James had not suffered a stroke, but was experiencing severe stress-related symptoms. He recommended continued observation overnight and psychiatric evaluation before release. I'd also suggest family counseling, he added, looking pointedly at the three of us. These issues clearly extend beyond one person's health. After he left, Emma spoke first. He's right. We need help sorting through all of this. The legal issues are one thing, but this, she gestured to encompass the three of us, this is something else entirely. James nodded his agreement, looking more like his father in that moment than I had ever noticed before. The realization brought an unexpected surge of emotion. I'll have Diana arrange something, I said. She mentioned a family therapist she respects. I stood, gathering my purse. I should go. You need to rest, James, and I have a meeting with the board this afternoon. About what? Emma asked, a hint of her old wariness returning. About the future of the company, I said simply. Your father's legacy, our family's legacy. I left them with those words, walking through the hospital corridors with a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The conversation had drained me emotionally, but it had also crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate even to myself, what I truly wanted from this painful process. Not revenge, though I'd briefly tasted its bitter satisfaction. Not money, though I would claim what was rightfully mine. What I wanted, I realized as I drove to the company headquarters, was restoration. Not of what had been that was impossible, but of what could still be. The board meeting that afternoon was tense, but productive. With George guiding the discussion, we addressed the company's immediate future in light of the legal proceedings against James and Emma. The district attorney is willing to consider a settlement that avoids jail time, I informed them. In exchange for full cooperation, financial restitution, and community service. Is that what you want? Howard Bennett asked, studying me carefully. Many in your position would push for maximum penalties. What I want is for the company to thrive with integrity, I replied. Sending my children to prison doesn't achieve that goal. And their roles moving forward? Patricia Walsh inquired. Surely they can't return to leadership positions after what they've done. Not immediately, no, I agreed. Perhaps not ever in the same capacity. But I'm not prepared to exile them permanently from the company their father built, that they helped build. Despite their other actions, the board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by my position. I continued before they could object. I'm proposing a new governance structure, one that maintains my majority ownership but establishes clear checks and balances. No family member, including me, should have unilateral authority over major decisions again. As Diana distributed the proposal we'd developed, I watched the board members' reactions. Most seemed cautiously supportive, recognizing that this offered a path forward that would stabilize the company while addressing the governance failures that had allowed the fraud to continue for years. And who would lead the company while this new structure is implemented? Robert Mason asked. George is only serving temporarily. I have some ideas about that, I said, but I'd like to discuss them with George and the executive team before making recommendations to the board. As the meeting concluded, George walked me to my car, his expression thoughtful. You're handling this better than anyone could have expected, he said. Michael would be proud. Would he? I wondered aloud. His children committed fraud. His company was corrupted. His legacy was tarnished. His wife is setting it right, George countered firmly. With wisdom and compassion, not just anger. Yes, he'd be proud. I let his words comfort me as I drove home, where Diana was waiting to discuss next steps. The legal process would continue for months, perhaps years, but the outline of a resolution was emerging, one that balanced accountability with possibility. The DA's office responded to our latest proposal, Diana said, sitting at my kitchen table. They're willing to accept the terms we discussed, with one addition. They want James and Emma to participate in financial ethics training programs for business students. To share their story as a cautionary tale, public humiliation as punishment. I observed. Essentially, she agreed, but also a chance for them to extract something positive from this mess, to help others avoid similar mistakes. I considered this, imagining my children standing before classrooms of students, acknowledging their wrongdoing. It would be difficult for them, especially for Emma, who had always been so conscious of appearances, but perhaps necessary for their own growth. I think they should do it, I decided. If they're truly committed to making amends, this is part of that process. Diana nodded, making a note. There's one more thing we need to discuss. The recovered funds. The accounts are being released to you next week. $12 million. Marianne, you need to decide what you want to do with it. I had been thinking about this question since she first mentioned the amount. $12 million more money than I had ever imagined possessing. Money that represented years of deception, but also years of the company's growth and success. I've made my decision, I told her, but I'll need your help setting it up properly. As I outlined my plan, Diana's expression shifted from surprise to admiration. You continue to astonish me, she said when I finished. Are you sure about this completely? I confirmed. It feels right. That night, I sat on my back porch, watching fireflies blink in the gathering darkness. So much had changed in the months since Mother's Day. The renovations on my house were complete modest updates rather than the luxury overhaul I could now afford. My relationship with my children was tentatively rebuilding. The company was finding its way forward under new governance, and I was different too. Stronger, clearer about who I was and what I valued. Less willing to be overlooked or dismissed, but also less interested in punishment than in healing. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more legal meetings, more therapy sessions, more difficult conversations. But for the first time since this journey began, I felt genuine hope that something worthwhile would emerge from the wreckage of betrayal and hurt. My phone chimed with a text message from Emma. Can we have coffee tomorrow? Just us. There are things I need to say. I typed back 11 a.m. at the cafe near your old school. Her response came quickly. I'll be there. Thank you, Mom. 2 simple words that meant more than she could know. 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning, I stood in the lobby of Wilson Building Supply headquarters, watching employees file in for the day. Many greeted me by name, now some with warmth, others with lingering wariness. I had become a regular presence here, not running the company but ensuring its governance reflected the values Michael had established. The past months had brought significant changes. James had accepted a plea deal requiring full restitution, 500 hours of community service, and a 3-year suspended sentence. He would never again serve as CEO, but after completing his ethics training and community service, he could potentially return in a non-executive role if the board approved. Emma had received a more lenient arrangement due to her cooperation, probation, financial ethics training, and a series of guest lectures at business schools about corporate ethics. She had surprised everyone, perhaps even herself, by embracing this last requirement, developing a compelling presentation about how small ethical compromises can lead to major breaches of integrity today. Marked another milestone in our family's ongoing reconstruction. The company was unveiling its new governance structure and announcing the permanent leadership team that would guide Wilson Building Supply forward. George met me by the elevator, his smile genuine if a bit tired. He had carried a heavy burden as interim CEO during the transition period. Big day, he remarked as we rode up to the executive floor. Nervous a little, I admitted. It's a significant change. Not everyone will be happy with it. It's the right direction, he assured me. Michael's company with Marianne's improvements. The boardroom was already filling with executives, board members, and key stakeholders when we arrived. Diana was there too, having helped design many of the legal safeguards in the new governance model. James and Emma sat side by side near the middle of the table, present, but not heading the meeting. A visual reminder of their altered status. At precisely 9 a.m., Howard Bennett called the meeting to order. As board chair, he had worked closely with me on the transition plan and now introduced me to present the new structure. Thank you all for being here today, I began, surveying the room. The past year has been challenging for Wilson Building Supply. The company faced a crisis of leadership and integrity that threatened everything my late husband built. I paused, meeting my children's eyes briefly before continuing. But crisis often creates opportunity for positive change. Today, we're implementing a governance structure that honors Michael Wilson's vision while incorporating modern best practices for family-owned businesses. Using the presentation Diana and I had prepared, I outlined the key elements: a professional CEO and executive team, a balanced board with family and independent directors, a family council to handle shareholder matters, and an ethics committee with real enforcement power. Most significantly, I continued, No single family member, including myself as majority shareholder, will have unilateral authority over major company decisions. The board must approve all strategic initiatives, executive compensation, and significant financial matters. The room remained attentive as I concluded the formal presentation and moved to the announcement many had been waiting for. It's now my privilege to introduce the person who will lead Wilson Building Supply into this new chapter. After an extensive search and unanimous board approval, I'm pleased to announce that Patricia Walsh will serve as our new Chief Executive Officer. Patricia, who had quietly resigned from the board the previous week to eliminate any conflict of interest, stood to warm applause. As one of the few female executives in the construction supply industry, she brought both relevant experience and a fresh perspective to the role. "Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to the board for your confidence," Patricia said, taking her place at the podium. "I'm honored to accept this responsibility and excited about the company's future." As Patricia outlined her vision for the company, I watched James and Emma carefully. James's expression was unreadable, though he applauded appropriately. Emma seemed more genuinely supportive, even nodding at several of Patricia's points about transparency and ethical leadership. After the formal presentations concluded and the room broke into smaller conversation groups, Emma approached me. "That was quite a speech," she said, her tone neutral. "Patricia is a good choice." "I think so," I agreed. "She understands both the industry and the importance of ethical leadership." Emma hesitated, then asked the question I knew was coming. "And us? What place do we have in this new version of the company?" "That's largely up to you," I told her honestly. "The Family Council gives both of you a voice in shareholder matters. Beyond that, your future roles will depend on how you fulfill the terms of your agreements and rebuild trust with the board." "Fair enough," she conceded, her gaze drifting to where James stood talking with George. "He's struggling more than he lets on the ethics lectures. Facing those students, it's been harder than he expected, and you?" I asked. A hint of her old confidence surfaced. "I'm finding it unexpectedly meaningful. Turns out I'm good at explaining complex ethical situations. 2 business students, several professors have asked me to return next semester." "I'm not surprised," I said. "You've always been an excellent communicator. Perhaps this is a way to use that talent for something positive." Our conversation was interrupted by Howard, announcing it was time for the official photograph to commemorate the new leadership team. I excused myself to join Patricia and the board members at the front of the room. Later that afternoon, I met with Diana at her office to finalize the last piece of my plan: the establishment of the Wilson Family Foundation. "The paperwork is ready," Diana confirmed, sliding a folder across her desk. "Once you sign, the foundation will be officially funded with $10 million from the recovered assets." "And the educational scholarship program?" I asked, reviewing the documents. "All set up according to your specifications. The first grants will be awarded this fall to students pursuing careers in construction-related fields, with preference given to those from underserved communities." I signed where indicated, feeling a sense of rightness about this decision. The money that had been hidden from me for years would now help create opportunities for others. Michael would have approved. "What about the remaining funds?" Diana asked. "The $2 million you kept personally? Some will go toward securing my retirement," I said. "The rest is being held in trust for any future grandchildren, with strict conditions attached. They'll need to demonstrate both academic achievement and community service to access their portions." Diana smiled approvingly. "Teaching values along with providing financial support. Wise choice." "I learned the hard way what happens when money comes without clear values attached," I replied. As spring turned to summer, our family continued its careful healing process. The weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Warren had evolved. From tense confrontations to more productive discussions about rebuilding trust and establishing healthier patterns of communication, James had found unexpected purpose in his community service, working with a nonprofit that built homes for veterans. The physical labor and tangible results seemed to center him in a way that corporate life never had. He and Sophia had begun marriage counseling, their relationship still fragile but no longer artificially maintained by shared secrets. Emma had postponed her wedding indefinitely, acknowledging that she and Bradley needed to reassess their relationship without the distorting influence of corporate power and hidden wealth. He had moved out of their shared apartment, though they continued to date more equally balanced now that her financial circumstances had changed, and I had found a new rhythm to my life, dividing my time between oversight of my majority shareholder responsibilities, involvement with the foundation, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been neglected during the years of focusing solely on my children, and then on exposing their deception. One year after the Mother's Day that had set everything in motion, I invited James, Sophia, Emma, and George to my home for dinner. It wasn't a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of how far we had come and how far we still had to go. The conversation over dinner was sometimes awkward, sometimes surprisingly warm. We avoided the heaviest topics, focusing instead on Georgia's recent fishing trip, Sophia's new position at a marketing firm, Emma's unexpected enjoyment of teaching. As we moved to the living room for coffee, James cleared his throat, clearly having prepared something to say. "Mom, I wanted to give you something," he said, handing me a small, wrapped package. "It's not much, but it's a start." Inside was a framed photograph I hadn't seen in years. Michael and me on the day we signed the papers for the original factory building, both of us beaming with pride and hope. Along with it was a handwritten card signed by both James and Emma. "Thank you for the second chance we didn't deserve. Happy Mother's Day." I felt tears threatening but managed to smile. "Thank you. This means a great deal to me. We found it when we were clearing out the old storage room at the office," Emma explained. Part of Patricia's initiative to honor the company's history properly, the gesture was small but significant in acknowledgement of the past we shared, the legacy their father had created, the place I had always held even when they'd tried to erase it. After everyone had gone, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The dogwood tree Michael had planted was in full bloom again, white flowers catching the fading light. In many ways, this journey had been the hardest of my life. More difficult even than losing Michael, whose death, while devastating, had at least been straightforward in its grief. This past year had forced me to confront painful truths about my children, my marriage, and myself. It had required me to stand firmly for what was right, while remaining open to healing and reconciliation. There was still a long road ahead. Trust, once broken, rebuild slowly. The legal consequences of my children's actions would continue to unfold for years. The new company governance would face inevitable challenges and adjustments. But sitting in my garden as dusk settled around me, I felt a quiet certainty that we were moving in the right direction. Not back to what had been that was impossible and perhaps undesirable. Forward, instead, toward something new that honored the best of our past while acknowledging and learning from its failures. I picked up the framed photograph James and Emma had given me, studying Michael's face, so young then, so full of dreams for the company he was building and the family he loved. "We're finding our way," I told him softly. "It's not perfect. It's not what we planned, but we're finding our way." A gentle breeze rustled through the dogwood blossoms, sending a few white petals drifting onto the patio around me. I watched them settle, fragile and beautiful in the gathering darkness. Sometimes, I had learned, love requires not just sacrifice but also accountability. Sometimes healing can only begin after painful truths are exposed. And sometimes, what appears to be an ending is actually the difficult, necessary beginning of something new. I closed my eyes, feeling at peace for the first time in longer than I could remember. Whatever tomorrow brought, we would face it not as perfect people, but as a family working to rebuild what had been broken. Stronger perhaps for having confronted the fractures that had divided us, and that, I decided as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, was legacy enough.